Franklin Foer, look at this brand new book. Wow. Congratulations. It's release week. What a huge week for you. I'm so glad you worked me in. Thank you very much for joining me.
Honored to be with you.
Well, there is a lot to say about this book, a ton of new reporting. Just talk a little bit about how you did this. You talked to so many people close to the president, including people who had been his friends like most of his life, family, etc.
Yeah. So, one of the hardest journalistic virtues is patience. Nobody's good at that. I'm not good at that. I started writing a book that was going to be about the first 100 days of Joe Biden's presidency. And then I got to the 100th day and he proposed his Build Back Better agenda and the infrastructure bill. And I thought, okay, that's the story. I'm going to stick it out till these bills pass. Then Joe Manchin goes on Fox News Sunday, pulls the plug on Build Back Better. And I'm like, crap, where's this book going to end? How's it going to end? What's my story? And my publisher was very wise. And she said, just do it through the end of the second year. And that was a lot more time than I ever intended spending on this book. But one of the virtues of just grinding it out and persisting in that sort of way is that when events are over, people want to talk to you. So everybody wants their part of history or to try to claim their part of history, especially when there's some successes. And so even something like Afghanistan, which was not, it's a mixed event, right? It's but hardly a success. Even then, people wanted like a therapist that they could talk to. And I felt like I just stuck around. I showed up enough. I became part of the furniture that people felt like they could talk to me.
Well, you have a reporting in your book that says the State Department needed a therapist, apparently at one point, brought in a therapy dog even. I mean, that's how good this reporting is.
It was funny when the person told me that they intended it as a positive to show how supportive they were of their employees. And I'm sure it was something that State Department employees appreciated. So many of them had connections to Afghanistan and were so traumatized by what they were hearing and what they were seeing. But yeah, it's one of my favorite details in the book.
Every page has specific details. It's the first of its kind to come out. You had probably unprecedented access no one else will get. And of course it's on these first 2 years, which could, I think in the end you hit kind of the sweet spot, because these first 2 years where I think you tell us in the book, most stuff happens for a president, and then often they lose control of Congress. They can't get major legislation passed. And that's pretty much what happened here. But remind us as to where the Biden administration was in terms of success and failure in that first year. Because, man, did it look bleak, like this old man was going to get nothing done. Jimmy Carter redux or any other stupid comparison I think people, including myself, made to it. Tell us what it was like that at the beginning.
Those were the pits of despair. And so there was a moment where I mentioned when Build Back Better imploded on Fox News Sunday with Manchin. Then Biden decides the left is freaking out. I'm going to make this big push on voting rights, even though everybody could see that it wasn't likely to go anywhere. And he ends up going to the Senate to meet with the Senate Democrats. And Manchin and Sinema have already made it amply clear to him that they're not going to abolish the filibuster. And so he's just compared opponents of the voting rights bill to Bull Connor. Mitch McConnell said, this is not the Joe Biden I know. And then Biden goes to apologize to McConnell, walks over to his office in the Senate, knocks on the door, and McConnell's not there. And to me, that's the nadir. That's bottom. You gotta the old senator wandering the halls of the Capitol, a president with only this infrastructure bill really to show for his efforts and the initial recovery plan. And things just don't look good. And that's actually kind of the story with Joe Biden, is that everything looks bleak. And then somehow he continually manages to outdo your expectations.
One thing I realized in reading this book, which is so good, couldn't put it down, really can't, so much intricacy of how government works, which I think is so important for people to know and entertaining too.
Can I just pause there? Because that you just said something that means a lot to me, which is that I tried to make government exciting. I feel like the way to for me, this book was a tonic after the Trump years. And as a liberal who believes in government and believes in governing, I wanted to try to make government and governing as exciting and sexy and important as it actually is.
Well, you've done it. You really have. We should talk off air. For a long time, I've wanted to do a propaganda documentary just about the inner workings of, say, the State Department, because it's so easy to demonize and demagogue bureaucrats, nameless or fish and wildlife. Go wherever you want. There are people doing really important and interesting, fascinating things, but that doesn't get kind of attention or ratings. But I think you did do it with this book. But my question is that, let's pick something. Most fascinated in this book by, well, all of it, but the Afghanistan withdrawal. I've read reporting and seen reporting from every single corner of that, from every narrative, from every point of view, people on the ground, the pundits, the generals. You do a great job at trying to get as many sources as you can, and to try, I think, to tell the real TikTok, the authentic story, especially in that chapter. You basically have, it's like the date and the time as it unfolded. So I kind of wanted to spend good piece of time just talking about the Afghan withdrawal, which you did a great job writing and reporting about. It's a nuanced, tough, hard to understand thing, but I suppose in your reporting, it would seem that the State Department wasn't necessarily on the same page as the White House, wasn't necessarily on the same page as the Department of Defense. There were different concerns, and most importantly, as you write, all of the intelligence said one thing, and what happened was something different. Is that fair to say?
I think that's all very fair. I tried to reconstruct it as a human event as opposed to anything else. That it's so easy to bluster about something, especially after the fact. So obviously they failed, right? Like things did not happen as they would have liked. And there's no arguing with that. But there were a lot of accusations of rank incompetence that trailed them in the aftermath of that. And what I was trying to capture was the way in which the human mind struggles to deal with the worst case scenario. And even if you think you understand what the worst case scenario is, it can get even worse than that when it arrives a couple weeks before you anticipate it arriving. And so much would have been different if they had flowed troops into Hamid Karzai Airport a week earlier. Like if they had expedited their worst case scenario planning a week earlier, then there would have been this measure of control at the airport. I think that they could have probably negotiated things with the Taliban in a more reasonable sort of way, because the Taliban didn't want the outcome that transpired either. The Taliban did not want to be put immediately in charge of governing Kabul, but they didn't want there to be all of this chaos at the airport. Their preference was to have an orderly transition of power that would be pre-negotiated with the United States and with the Afghan ruling class, because they didn't want to be a pariah. At least some parts of the Taliban, the ones that were kind of in charge of the negotiation, didn't want there to be street by street fighting. They didn't want to become a pariah nation, because they knew if they were kind of instantly in charge without some alliance with the rest of the Afghan, then they would be frozen out of all the international money that they needed in order to have any chance at success.
There were so many people that were involved with this withdrawal. But let me just ask you, one thing that frustrated me in watching this, and I've watched the war from the beginning to the end, covered in many ways a lot of it, never as an on-the-ground journalist, but talking to so many of the experts and players. And to me, Obama, he escalated the war in Afghanistan when he was, quote, boxing by his generals. And Joe Biden, as his vice president, was one of the few voices against that. Obviously, Bush invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, perpetuated the war there. It seems like every general said, oh, just give me the troops and the resources and we can clear, hold, and build and win here. In the end, Joe Biden was the president who was brave enough to take a chance at what turned out to be a disaster and one of the worst moments of his presidency. 13, I think it was, U.S. military died in that bombing in Afghanistan. Obviously, a whole bunch of people got left behind. It was terrible for him politically, but I just give him so much credit for doing the thing that politicians never have been able to do, Democrats and Republicans, especially when it comes to foreign policy and war. And we didn't even talk yet, and you've got great reporting about Ukraine. So I just wanted to get your...
I totally agree with you. I mean, I 90% agree with you. But I think that it was probably always going to end messily. Like there was no way to avoid that, because the Afghan government was propped up by the U.S. military. And Joe Biden knew that. I think knowing that, I think that there were certain things that they could have planned for that maybe would have curbed some of the worst parts of the withdrawal. But that said, I do think it takes courage to sight through the conventional wisdom in the way that he did. And I give him so much credit for sticking to his guns, never backing down, never pointing the finger elsewhere, never deflecting blame onto somebody else, and never backing away from his conviction that this was the right course for American foreign policy. And you talk about Ukraine, I'm not sure that we could have devoted the resources to Ukraine if we were still stuck in Afghanistan. There's a lot of weaponry we were able to flow into Ukraine that I'm not sure we could have done in good conscience if we were still in Afghanistan.
Well, let's talk about Ukraine then, because you have amazing reporting, what you've learned there. You got the first full account of the relationship between President Biden and this guy who doesn't get a lot of criticism in Western media, obviously the right-wing media and the crazies, but he's seen as a real hero and a real leader and kind of a fluke of a leader. He's a comedian, and then he became the leader, and then he fought Mother Russia. But between Biden and Zelensky, the relationship was not great, and Joe Biden apparently didn't have a lot of respect for his leadership experience and potentially his judgment. Talk to us a little bit about what we learned. You could barely scratch the surface in an interview like this.
Well, it was so interesting. I remember my first reporting calls after the invasion of Ukraine, and I started talking to people, and I would ask the question, what is, what's this relationship like? I assumed it would be kind of like a mentor-protege relationship because of the age difference. And what I heard was, oh, no, it's not like that. And then as time went on, it just started to become clearer that it was a very difficult relationship because Zelensky, and also understandably difficult. So I think everything you said about Zelensky is true. He is a hero. It took him some time to grow into his job. Remember, it was kind of that first week of the war, he surprised everybody with his leadership skills. And so that's all totally true. But Zelensky's job as president of Ukraine is to apply enormous pressure on Western leaders to make sacrifices and decisions that are uncomfortable for them.
That's his job. Yeah, that is a huge percentage of his job, is to get the resources he needs, hence putting the pressure on Western and keeping it on. Sorry to interrupt you.
No. And Joe Biden's job is to do his best for Ukraine and also to prevent a nuclear war. And so I would ask Biden advisors, what's the question that Biden always asks in meetings about Ukraine? And the answer was, if I give them this weapon system, what are the odds that it increases Russian escalation in this conflict? And he's a child of the Cold War. And so he remembers what it's like to do, hide under his desk in a bomb drill. So he was just determined to do his best for Ukraine, to give them as much as humanly possible without totally breaking the politics of the war. Because remember, there's a very skeptical American public here. Americans have been fairly supportive of Ukraine, but like a couple years ago, Americans were totally indifferent to autocracy. The European allies were totally indifferent to autocracy. And so he needed to bring along the public in a way that their support would be sustainable over the long haul. And so he did that. And also at moments, he could have probably gone further in giving them weapon systems. But I'm also kind of grateful to have a president of the United States who's worried about preventing nuclear war. So I give him props for that. And that's the type of thing people talk about his age. And it's true. Age is an issue. And it would be foolish to deny that. On the other hand, with all that experience, he's navigated these two major foreign policy touch points with China and with Russia, where we're dealing with nuclear powers and we're dealing with the potential for dangerous relationships to badly get mismanaged, for them to escalate out of control, to spiral beyond our ability to keep it on the rails. And I give him major props for applying pressure on both China and Russia without going too far. And I do wonder what would happen if there was with a different president in power.
It's the question we'll never know, but the answer to. But you do as much as you can in your reporting and writing The Last Politician to educate us on how these decisions were made. And this is a book really ostensibly about Joe Biden and his leadership, but there's so much in your book about the people who work for him, from the cabinet secretaries, the vice president, who we haven't talked about yet, to others. And, I thought it might be interesting just to ask you about a couple of them. One guy I've always been pretty fascinated and really impressed with, well, I would say two really, are Ron Klain and Jake Sullivan, both of which you write a lot about. But I thought I just might ask you about Jake Sullivan, because a lot of the credit for Biden's accomplishments go to the people who are advising him. Certainly he's the decision maker in the end, but say a bit about Jake Sullivan and his role and how he must never sleep.
Yeah. Well, so Jake Sullivan is a guy who came up. He was kind of a wonderkind who
National Security Advisor. Forgive me.
He's a national security advisor. He was an aide to Hillary Clinton in the State Department and played a very significant role in her campaign. And after her defeat, after her defeat, he was very, very rattled about the success of Trump's populism, and he spent a lot of time thinking hard about it. He ran a series of focus groups in Ohio and Nebraska through the Carnegie Endowment, where they tried to understand what was it about foreign policy that was so alienating to middle America. And one of the things that he came away with was that all these trade deals that he thought were so great for the country turned out to resonate badly in places like Minnesota, where he's from. And so he started to reconsider his positions on all of that. And so he started to change his economics views. He started to change his foreign policy views. And that led to the construction of the Build Back Better agenda in the campaign, with its emphasis on manufacturing and industrial policy, which represented a real change in the political economy of the Democratic Party.
He's a really impressive guy in so many ways. I'd love to meet him and interview him at some point. But one of the other, I think, really important issues here is the beginning of the Biden presidency, the beginning of your book. Probably should have started there with the beginning of this interview, but who gives a fuck? And so the point is, one thing I think of often is when Barack Obama, the last two Democrats, became presidents, they came in at like the worst time. Obama came in, there were 800,000 jobs a month. It was the economic crisis. When Biden came in, there was a terrible unemployment issue as a result of the pandemic, and COVID was still raging. You write about the muted inauguration. It had just had an insurrection. The country was reeling, and the major goal was to roll out the vaccines. Talk a little bit about how that was handled by President Biden and some of the important moments and players.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell one story about Ron Klain, who you mentioned, who was who was his chief staff. It meshes with what you were describing. And so there was a meeting at the beginning of the book with Mark Meadows, who was Trump's chief of staff, in the scheduled for the morning of the inauguration. So you got the chief of staff, who probably would rather be watching the inauguration of his president, of his new boss, gets called to meet in the White House with Mark Meadows. And Meadows says, be there at 10 a.m. And so Klain shows up at 10 a.m. and he's sitting around waiting in the halls. Meadows isn't there. He gets a phone call, 20 minutes later from Meadows being like, dude, I'm so sorry. Didn't mean to be blowing you off. I got Trump started out late today. And so then he comes into the White House eventually, sees Klain, says, man, good to see you, but sorry, I can't tell you anything more. I've got to go bring a pardon over to the Department of Justice. And it was like this transition. To me, it was a moment that captured this transition, which was a total mess from just for all the reasons we know, with Trump undermining the legitimacy of the election and the like. But the importance of a presidential transition, which is enshrined in law, is to make it so that you have information that gets handed to the new administration so that they can do their jobs starting on day one. That there is this interest that the nation has in continuity of government. So you have something like the vaccine, where Trump had invested a lot of money through Operation Warp Speed in the development of vaccines, and the Biden people needed to know if there was a plan to get those shots in people's arms. And so they spent the whole month of November and December and early January in search of this plan. And they were stiff-armed by the Trump administration consistently, forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, not allowed to meet with civil servants. It was a total freaking mess. And so, but ultimately they discovered there was no plan for getting shots in arms. And we talked at the beginning about your propaganda idea on behalf of government.
Yeah.
Well, if there was anything that described kind of the potential of government to do good, it's the vaccine rollout. That within 6 months, it was possible to stroll into your neighborhood CVS without an appointment to get a shot in your arm that would save your life. And so everything that went into that, the scaling up of production, the distribution system for the vaccine, the relationship with the pharmacies, all of the seamless technology that went into making that happen. I think it's one of the most successful government programs of all time. And yet, neither government nor the Biden administration is ever going to get any credit for it.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point. And that's a really important time to think about. I think it's so easy to just move on to the next news story, which is why this book is so important right now for the public and for history in general. You write about so many of the different relationships and the moments in these past 2 years, and I can't even believe it's only been 2 years. It's absolutely crazy. But the vaccine rollout was so consequential, and yeah, they're never going to get the kind of success. But Ron Klain, of course, had worked on, I think, AIDS in the past. Like, he took this so seriously.
He was the czar for Ebola in the Obama administration. As a consequence, he had an understanding of the public health system, and they appointed Jeff Zients, who replaced Klain as chief of staff, as the COVID czar. And what was instructive and interesting about that is that Zients didn't have health experience, as Klain hadn't had public health experience when he became Ebola czar. And the idea was that you needed just a government operator. You didn't need somebody who understood all of these intricate policy things. You needed somebody who knew how to make governmental systems hum, who knew how to make them work, who knew how to smash heads together to get results, and knew how to drive a process. And so I think both Zients and Klain deserve enormous amounts of credit for creating the overall architecture of the government's COVID response.
The pharmaceutical industry also worked really hard, obviously, to get that vaccine out to fulfill the receipt, and did a really good job as well. I mean, I can demonize them all day, but they worked together with the administration pretty well before they cranked up prices and all kinds of other things.
One of the things that I learned about in the course of reporting my book was that Pfizer, which became the workhorse vaccine of the pandemic, had a terrible relationship with the Trump administration because it hadn't taken Operation Warp Speed money. It didn't want to get tangled up in the government in that sort of way. So one of the initial things that the Biden people did was they restored this relationship with Pfizer, and then they used the power of the government in order to ramp up its production. So in order to create these facilities, there was something called it's like a mobile lab. And they basically, suspended all the rules and regulations and managed to transport this mobile lab from Texas to Kalamazoo, Michigan. And it was just a public-private partnership where the government eliminated all of the bureaucratic obstacles to making this thing happen, so that they could use the Defense Production Act, they could use all of their authority to just speed things along.
Really, really important. And let me move on to perhaps the most important, or one of the most high-profile relationships that hasn't. I feel like the reporting has been shit on the vice president, Kamala Harris, what she's been assigned to. Maybe that's always the case, but I feel like this time is different. I feel like she has done a really good job. She's also been tasked with things that are kind of impossible. Give her immigration, give her the things that you need comprehensive legislation for to change, put her in charge of that. But also the reporting on his relationship with her and how he sees her. I think a lot of people could see her as like a token, a woman, a black woman that's not going to get the attention and respect of the principal, the president in this case. But he was vice president before. He had a little experience with that /8 years. And so he knows what it's like. And apparently, your reporting is, I feel like, gives a whole different look on their relationship and Vice President Kamala Harris as is.
I try to be empathetic to her. And I think the other thing that I think needs to be said, my book ends after year 2. And I think she's probably had her best year in year 3, where because of the Dobbs decision and being the face of the administration on the abortion issue, she's found a political identity. And that was, I think, one of the big struggles for her in her first 2 years, is that she didn't know where she fit in the whole constellation of the administration. In meetings, everybody says she was excellent. And this is kind of the rap on some high performing vice presidents. Like Al Gore had the same sort of rap. Everybody said, he's brilliant in meetings, but his political persona just sucks. And I think something similar could be said of Kamala Harris during, that she's as a prosecutor, she's got a style, and she can really drill down on things. And I would ask neutral people, like generals, what do you make of Kamala Harris's performance? And they all respected the way that she would perform in debates over Afghanistan and the like, that she was on top of everything and asked incisive questions. But I think that it's hard to be a former vice president's vice president. And Joe Biden refracted their entire relationship through his own relationship with Barack Obama. And it was a complicated relationship. Obama would roll his eyes at Biden. He thought he talked too much in meetings. But that was aesthetic. When it came to the actual substance of their relationship, he knew that there were holes in his resume that Biden could help fill on foreign policy and his relationship with the Senate. Biden is so supremely self-confident based on all of his years of experience that there's not a lot that he considers a hole in his resume that he needs a vice president to fill. And so I think that left Kamala Harris in a tough position in the first couple of years.
Well, it's funny you say that, because maybe the hole that he needs filling, it was a terrible choice of words regarding the subject, is women's reproductive rights. Because, you mentioned this last year in the Dobbs decision and how Kamala Harris has stepped up, but you also write about the Biden administration's response to the Dobbs decision, to the Supreme Court, what they anticipated, what actually happened. And then President Biden's personal feeling on abortion, which sound to me, according to your reporting, and we've known this to a certain extent, but now more specifically, they sound to me like old and Catholic, Frank.
Yeah, he's ambivalent and tortured, I think, is another way to put it, I don't think that's true now, but I think that he's somebody who's evolved on this issue in part for political reasons in order to keep up with the party, which has changed on abortion over time. But in part, as a guy from the 1980s, he struggles to make sense sometimes of the modern right-wing movement. And I think he didn't really appreciate the radicalism of Dobbs and the radicalism of the Supreme Court until he was smacked in the face with it. So coming out of Dobbs, he wanted to talk about privacy. He was reluctant to go all in on responses to it. I'd give him some political credit for that. I think his instincts were right, that Republicans had created a problem of their own making. He didn't need to distract from that with any sort of solution that he needed to propose that would overreach. But there was this incident, I'm sure everybody remembers, with a 10-year-old girl from Ohio who had to go to Indianapolis to get an abortion. And for Biden, that was a very crystallizing moment that I think he saw how extreme the response to Dobbs was, that we're not talking about third trimester abortions or all the other debates that had consumed the country. This was full-scale repeal wielded cruelly against the most, defenseless people. And Biden, as somebody who has this kind of that story, I think, meshed with the sorts of morality tales that tend to move Biden at the end of the day.
Yeah, I just wish that it didn't take that. I wish that he didn't have the feelings he had on kind of quote late term abortion, which is a weird term kind of made up by the anti-abort. Like, I wish he would be vocal and tell the truth the way his former press secretary Jen Psaki had a great 4 or 5 minute monologue about what it means to have a late term abortion, the life of the baby, the life of the mother, and how absolutely rare it is. And it's not controversial hardly at all, and it's so rare. I wish President Biden would come out and teach the American public, because that has been so convincing to a lot of people. Well, I'm pro-choice, but not in the late term. It's like, what? Who the hell are you talking about? Do you know anybody that's ever had to go through that? It's hell.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he came from the place he came from, which is another era. I think it's hard. I think the Catholic Church has made it hard for progressive Catholics to be true to themselves on this issue. And I know for Nancy Pelosi, for John Kerry, for a lot of other people who've been in Biden's position, there's this sense of misery that it comes when having your bishops denounce you, and it plays games with your mind. And I think that happens.
I have no patience for that. If my bishop denounced me, I would take it as a badge of honor, because you know what he's not denouncing. Father O'Malley, who's doing terrible shit. Like, I just have no patience for that. I can say this because I'm a former Catholic. Talk about Joe Manchin and Vice President Kamala Harris. Were you right at one point, like, he walked out of the room and she didn't say goodbye to him? Of course, they served in the Senate together. And you write a lot about, like, Joe Manchin, or a couple of times, having his feelings hurt. He seems like a very pathetic guy to me, or his ego is just he had so much power, to be fair, in the Senate. It was all up to him. Anything you want, because you have a lot of reporting and really interesting stuff on Joe Manchin's relationship with Kamala Harris. And obviously we could talk about, which is fascinating, how Joe Biden did everything he could to win him over.
Yeah. So, I mean, the bottom line for the Democrats was that Joe Manchin didn't really want to do anything. He's a very conservative Democrat, and his ties to the Democratic Party are vestigial. It's like he comes from a family that's been involved in the party. He keeps winning in West Virginia despite the way that the state has turned. But he hasn't given up his membership in the Democratic Party. I always find it very interesting that Sinema has abandoned caucusing with the Democrats, but Manchin continues to persist in doing it. And now he's making all this noise about running as a third party candidate with no labels. And the only thing that makes me believe that he won't do that is why hasn't he abandoned caucusing with the Democratic Party? But he didn't want to. He had some fair critiques of the way in which the bill had been structured, where they were jamming all of these programs in without the funding for the long run in order to make them actually sustainable. I mean, you could argue that either way, but that was a substantive critique. But I think fundamentally, he just didn't like all of the expansion of the safety net, all of the redistribution that was involved with the bill.
And the clean energy stuff. Wait, are we talking about the same bill?
The same bill. I mean, the clean energy stuff he was interesting on that, because he wanted to take away anything that was regulatory, that was punitive towards the fossil fuel industry. He was willing to invest in the clean energy transition, but he wouldn't do anything that would make fossil fuel industry pay any sort of price for its destruction of the planet.
Say whatever you want about President Biden, his relationship with the Chinese. What a complicated relationship. But man, reading this book, it's like we gotta almost get readouts of the conversation that he has with the Chinese leader, Xi, and it's pretty fascinating. Not to mention Putin. And those are some of the most interesting things. You think of Joe Biden as kind of sometimes as doddering guy. Obviously, he's a foreign policy expert in his day, and that doesn't mean he's always right, but he has deep thoughts, opinions, and a lot of experiences on how to deal with foreign leaders. Now he's president, dealing with the Chinese leader, the Russian leader, and you've got a lot in here about both. As we wrap up our conversation, what do you want to say about his relationship with the Chinese and the Russians?
Well, there was a moment in the middle of the early Ukraine war where we got intelligence that the Russians had asked the Chinese for weaponry.
Yeah.
And we got intelligence that the Chinese were willing to go ahead with that plan. And as it happened, Jake Sullivan had a pre-planned meeting with his Chinese counterpart in Rome that week. And Sullivan kind of ambushed the Chinese with this intelligence that we had about Ukraine. And the Chinese seemed a little bit flummoxed by that. And they immediately set up a leader-to-leader video conference for the end of that week where Biden and Xi would talk. And Biden wanted to make Xi know that there would be some price to be paid without kind of crazily pointing the finger or escalating. And so he told him, I didn't need to lift a finger with the Russia sanctions. Like every Western business pulled out of Russia straight away because they didn't want to be on the wrong side of this. And I think I'd be worried that the same thing could happen to China if China somehow got embroiled in this conflict. And then she started talking about how the U.S. was building bioweapons labs in Ukraine, which is a core piece of Russian propaganda. And Biden just kind of lost it then. It was the tensest conversation he's apparently had with Xi, where he's like, you're peddling crap here. And
we were not building biolabs. It was a total propaganda play that the Russians made up. We aren't doing that. And so when the Chinese president says that to the US president, he's like, bullshit, dude, where are you getting that information? That's not true. Show me the evidence.
Exactly. And then after that meeting, it turned out that China didn't supply Russia with arms. And I think that was a very important moment in the war, because if the Chinese had aligned with the Russians militarily, it would be a totally different conflict. And so sometimes that diplomacy is knowing how to have that kind of tough conversation where you're blunt, where you know exactly how to calibrate your bluster so that it makes the other side think twice about its actions. Yeah. And even just showing your hand sometimes can cause the other side to back down.
Oh, I've watched The Diplomat on Netflix and Madam Secretary on whatever that was on. And I think I know plenty about how the State Department leverages the best. I mean, those shows make me so badly want to be in or around any diplomat anywhere to know how these deals get made and where the leverage lies. And, just speaking of which, and I guess we can end on the president's conversations with and relationship with Vladimir Putin. Great reporting in your book about Putin wanted to talk to him on day one, apparently. And, you have great context on what the recent history with Russia and America have been and, interfering in our election, the solar winds hack. You read all about this. And then all of a sudden he's on the phone with the new president who is not his best friend.
Yeah. And his mission there was to try to figure out a way to try to make Putin feel respected. He knew Putin would be the source of mischief during his administration. And he thought, the best I can do is try to limit the damage that he can cause. And so I need to send him tough warnings while conveying to him, perhaps, that I respect him as the leader of a great nation. And that didn't work in the end, of course. But I think it was probably the best hand that he had to play.
Last question is, I know you've talked about your thoughts and opinions of Joe Biden before you wrote the book, and then after you spent, a long time talking to so many people. What was how was your mind at the beginning? How is it now about President Biden?
So I admit I began the book with a very conventional Washington opinion of the man, which was that I thought he was kind of a blowhard. I didn't like his talk about bipartisanship, which I thought was dangerously naive. But that expression that familiarity breeds contempt. Yeah. And I think with him, it was kind of different. It was like the familiarity bred admiration and respect, and that there were wrinkles of Biden that I hadn't appreciated. The way in which his empathy connects to his governing skills, his legislative skills, that his ability to sit across from a foreign leader or Joe Manchin or Mitch McConnell, whoever, and to put himself in their minds and to understand their emotional makeup, their self-interest, which allows him to deal with them in a way that's actually human, as opposed to dealing with a stick figure. And it's just turned out to be more effective than I thought it would be.
The book is so good. Everybody needs to go get it. The Last Politician, Inside Joe Biden's White House and the Struggle for America's Future. Franklin, I've followed your career, talked to you in the past about your work at The Atlantic and elsewhere, and always been a big fan. I love this book. Congratulations. And this is probably the best interview you've done because of my prep and research and actually reading the book. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you for not just cherry picking the book for the most sensationalist thing and then running with that. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, man. I'll talk to you again soon. Congrats.
Okay, take care.